My father never called me by my name when he was angry. He called me the problem child. The first time I remember hearing it, I was barely 6. I had dropped a glass of milk on the kitchen floor. It shattered, white liquid spreading like a crime scene. My siblings froze. My mother rushed for a cloth. My father didn't move at all. He just looked at me with that familiar mix of disappointment and irritation. "There," he said, pointing at me, "the problem child again." Everyone laughed nervously, as if it were a joke. I didn't laugh. I felt something sink deep inside my chest. Something heavy and sharp that never quite left. From that day on, the title stuck. If I asked too many questions, I was being difficult. If I stayed quiet, I was sulking. If I cried, I was dramatic. No matter what I did, it was wrong, because I was wrong. My siblings lived under the same roof, but in a completely different world. When my brother broke a window, my father blamed bad luck. When my sister talked back, it was brushed off as teenage mood swings. But when I made the smallest mistake, it became proof of my character. "You've always been like this," my father would say, "always causing trouble." I didn't understand what this was. I followed rules better than anyone. I stayed out of fights. Teachers praised me for being polite and responsible. Yet every evening, I came home to a man who looked at me as if I were a burden he'd been forced to carry. My mother never defended me. She hovered in the background, eyes lowered, hands busy. Sometimes I caught her watching me with a sadness she quickly hid. When my father criticized me, she stayed silent. Her silence hurt almost as much as his words. At family gatherings, my father told stories about me like warnings. "This one," he'd say, nodding toward me, "has always been hard to handle." Relatives smiled sympathetically. I smiled too, because I didn't know what else to do. At night, I lay awake wondering what was wrong with me. I replayed every conversation, every mistake, trying to find the flaw my father saw so clearly. I promised myself I'd do better tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. By the time I was 10, I had learned to disappear. I spoke only when spoken to. I kept my room spotless. I brought home perfect grades. I hoped desperately that one day my father would look at me and say he was proud. Instead, he said, "Don't get too comfortable. You always mess things up eventually." Those words became my shadow. At school, I was the good child. At home, I was the problem. I watched my siblings receive affection freely. Hugs, jokes, patience. With me, love felt conditional, fragile, like glass waiting to shatter. Sometimes I caught my father staring at me when he thought I wasn't looking. His expression wasn't anger, it was something colder, something distant, as if he were looking at a stranger who had wandered into his life uninvited. I didn't know then that children can sense rejection long before they understand it. By my teenage years, resentment filled the spaces where hope used to live. I stopped trying to impress him. The label had already been written. Nothing I did could erase it. When I finally left home at 18, my father didn't hug me goodbye. "Try not to be a problem out there too," he said. I believed him. For years I carried that name with me, the problem child, never knowing it wasn't describing who I was. It was revealing who he was, and the truth behind it would change everything. Leaving home was supposed to feel like freedom. Instead, it felt like being pushed into the world without a map, carrying a voice in my head that never stopped reminding me that I was too much, too difficult, too wrong. I moved to a small apartment with thin walls and creaking floors. It wasn't much, but it was mine. No one criticized how I folded my clothes or sighed when I entered a room. Still, my father's words followed me everywhere. They showed up in job interviews, in friendships, in every relationship I tried to build. Whenever something went wrong, I didn't ask why. I assumed it was my fault. I worked twice as hard as everyone else, afraid that if I slowed down, someone would notice the truth about me, the truth my father had drilled into me for years. When my boss praised my dedication, I smiled politely and waited for the criticism that never came. It made me uneasy. Love was worse. Anyone who treated me kindly felt suspicious. Anyone who raised their voice, even slightly, sent me spiraling back to my childhood kitchen, milk spreading across the floor, my father's finger pointing at me. "You're being dramatic," my partners would say during arguments, and just like that, my father's voice won again. I stayed too long in relationships that hurt me because pain felt familiar. I apologized for things I didn't do. I learned how to shrink myself so I wouldn't become the problem again. Years passed like this quiet survival disguised as independence. I visited my parents out of duty, not desire. Family dinners were polite but tense. My siblings talked about their lives, their plans, their successes. My father listened to them with interest. When I spoke, he interrupted or corrected me. "You always exaggerate," he'd say. My mother still avoided my eyes. The guilt in her silence had grown heavier with time. One winter, everything changed. I received a call from my sister late at night. My father had collapsed. The word hospital echoed in my mind long after the call ended. I stared at my phone, unsure of what I felt. Fear, obligation, relief. I returned home the next day. The house smelled the same, cleaning chemicals and old furniture. But the tension felt sharper, like a storm waiting to break. My father lay in a hospital bed in the living room, machines humming softly around him. When he saw me, his expression tightened. "So," he said weakly, "you decided to show up." There it was, even now. I sat silently by the window, watching snow fall. My mother hovered nearby, wringing her hands. At one point, she opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, then closed it again. That night, I overheard my parents arguing in hushed voices. "You never should have treated them like that." My mother whispered, "You wanted this too." My father snapped, "Don't pretend you didn't." My heart pounded. Treated me like what? Wanted what? When I stepped closer, the room went silent. The next morning, my uncle visited. He pulled me aside, his face pale and nervous. "There's something you should know," he said. "Years ago, doctors questioned your father's blood type during a procedure. It didn't match yours. The words didn't make sense at first." "What are you saying?" I asked. "I'm saying there may be more to the story than you've been told." For the first time in my life, the label problem child felt unstable, like it was built on something fragile, something false. I didn't have proof yet, just a feeling, but deep inside, a quiet thought took shape, one that scared me as much as it comforted me. What if I was never the problem at all? And what if the answer my father feared was finally coming for him? The truth arrived quietly, disguised as paperwork and medical urgency. 2 days after my uncle's confession, my father's condition worsened. Doctors rushed in and out of the house, their faces tight with concern. At some point, a young nurse asked routine questions: blood type, family history, inherited conditions. My mother froze. I don't remember." She said too quickly. The nurse frowned. "We'll need to run some tests, including a DNA match for accuracy." No one argued. I sat in the hallway while blood samples were taken. My hands trembled, not from fear of the results, but from the strange sense that something I had carried my entire life was about to be set down. When the doctor finally called us into a small room, the air felt heavy enough to choke on. "I'll be direct," she said gently. "The test confirms there is no biological relationship between you and the man you call your father." The words landed like thunder, yet everything inside me went silent. No relationship, no shared blood. For a moment I couldn't breathe. Then I laughed softly, almost hysterically. 29 years of self. Blame unraveled in seconds. My mother broke down completely. Years of carefully controlled silence shattered into sobs she could no longer contain. My siblings stared at the floor, stunned. My father didn't move. His face had lost all color. His mouth opened, then closed again. The man who had always been so loud, so certain, suddenly had nothing to say. I turned to my mother. "Is it true?" I asked. "All of it." She nodded, tears streaming. "I was young, I was scared, I made a mistake. When I found out I was pregnant, your father agreed to raise you as his own. But only if no one ever found out." The room felt smaller. "Then why?" I whispered. "Why punish me?" My father finally spoke, his voice hollow, "Because every time I looked at you," he said, "I saw the lie. The lie. Not a child, not a human being, a lie. Something inside me broke open, not into rage, but clarity, the coldness, the cruelty, the constant rejection. None of it was random. It was intentional, fueled by resentment he never had the courage to confront. "You blamed me," I said slowly, "for a choice you made." He looked away. For the first time in my life, I saw him not as a powerful figure, but as a weak man hiding behind authority. His control had come from secrecy, and now the secret was gone. My siblings finally spoke, their voices filled with disbelief. "Why didn't you tell us?" one of them asked. My mother sobbed harder. I was ashamed. I stood up. All my life, I had imagined this moment differently. I thought I would scream, accuse, demand apologies, but standing there I felt calm. I spent my entire life thinking I was broken. I said, "I tried to fix myself to earn love that was never going to come, and my father said nothing. I don't hate you," I continued. "But I'm done carrying your guilt." That was the moment the power shifted. The man who once defined me with a single cruel phrase no longer had any control over who I was. The label problem child dissolved under the weight of truth. I walked out of that room with my head held high. Behind me, my father sat alone, trapped with the consequences of his choices. Ahead of me was something unfamiliar, something I had never been given before. Freedom, and the final chapter of this story would be written on my terms. The days after the DNA results were surreal. Life in the house continued, but nothing felt the same. My father moved like a shadow, quiet, subdued, stripped of the authority he had wielded for decades. My siblings avoided his eyes, uncertain how to treat the man who had raised me with cruelty and now had no claim over me. I, on the other hand, felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time, I could separate who I was from who he said I was. I could finally see the pattern of abuse for what it truly was. Not my fault, not my failing, but the consequence of secrets and pride. I decided to take my time before speaking again. Words, I realized, were weapons I no longer needed. The truth itself had been enough to dismantle the control my father held over me. At the family gathering that weekend, the atmosphere was strained. My mother, trembling, tried to bridge the silence. My siblings whispered among themselves, cautious not to provoke my father. He sat stiffly, attempting to retain composure, but his eyes betrayed confusion, anger, and fear. I chose my moment carefully. Standing tall, I addressed the room, my voice calm but firm. "I have spent 29 years believing I was unlovable, broken, a problem," I said. Silence fell, but the truth is I am none of those things. I am whole, I am strong, and I am no longer defined by the cruelty of someone else. The words cut through the tension like a blade, leaving my father speechless. For once, I wasn't pleading for his approval. I wasn't shrinking to fit his expectations. I wasn't hiding behind silence. I was claiming my identity, and that, perhaps, was the sweetest revenge of all. My mother's tears flowed freely, a mix of relief and remorse. My siblings, seeing me stand unshaken, realized that the old dynamics had shifted irrevocably. My father, who had once wielded intimidation like a sword, had nothing left. His guilt, his shame, and his own insecurities now defined him more than I ever could. I didn't yell, I didn't accuse. I simply lived in the clarity of truth. The freedom that came with it was far more satisfying than any confrontation could ever be. For years, I had dreamed of revenge, imagining dramatic confrontations and long speeches. But now I understood. True power lies not in destruction, but in rising above, in refusing to let the past dictate your worth. In the following weeks, I made quiet but decisive changes. I legally changed my last name, cutting ties symbolically and spiritually. I sought therapy, confronting the layers of trauma my father's words had left behind. I nurtured relationships that recognized my worth rather than questioned it. Every step forward felt like a small victory, a reclamation of the life I was always meant to live. And my father. He became a cautionary tale to those around him. a man whose authority crumbled under the weight of truth, whose cruelty left him isolated, and whose secrets had finally found daylight. He learned in his own way that you cannot control the lives of others through fear and deception. One evening, as I walked through the city streets, I felt a profound sense of peace. I could finally breathe without the weight of someone else's judgment pressing down on me. I didn't need apologies. I didn't need acknowledgement. I had something far greater, my freedom, my dignity, and my own voice. The greatest revenge, I realized, wasn't anger, confrontation, or humiliation. It was simply living fully, unapologetically, and with the knowledge that I am enough. 29 years of being called the problem child had come to an end, not with a shout, but with a life reclaimed. And for the first time, I was no longer defined by the shadows of the past. I was defined by the strength I carried into the future. I smiled softly to myself. The problem, it seemed, had never been me. It had been the lie, and I had finally broken free.